I didn't notice when the questions stopped. At least, not right away. If someone had asked me during that time how the relationship was going, I probably would have said something simple, something automatic. Good. And I would have believed it. Because nothing obvious had changed. We were still seeing each other every day, still eating dinner together most nights, still sleeping in the same bed. From the outside, our life looked exactly the way it always had. But when I think about that period now, the thing I remember most clearly isn't something that happened. It's something that quietly stopped happening. We stopped asking each other questions. And somehow, that changed everything. When we first met, questions were the entire relationship. That's the easiest way I can describe the beginning. We met through a friend at a small birthday dinner. One of those casual nights where a few people end up sitting around a long table in a restaurant talking longer than anyone expected. She was sitting across from me. I remember noticing that she didn't talk just to fill the space. She listened first. And when she asked something, she actually waited for the answer. That felt rare enough that I noticed it immediately. At some point during the dinner, she asked me where I grew up. It wasn't a complicated question, but the way she asked it made it feel like she actually wanted to know. So I told her about the small town, about leaving, about how strange it felt to return there sometimes. And when I finished, she didn't just nod and move on. She asked another question. What made you decide to leave? I remember laughing a little when she asked that, because most people don't follow up like that. They move on to the next topic. But she stayed there, inside the conversation, curious. And that's how the whole evening unfolded. Question after question, answer after answer. The kind of conversation where time disappears because neither person is trying to end it. We walked out of the restaurant together that night. Not because we had planned to. It just happened naturally. The air outside was cool. People were standing on the sidewalk talking. Cars moving slowly through the street. And we kept asking each other things. What kind of music she listened to. What she liked about the city. What her childhood was like. Nothing dramatic. Just curiosity. But curiosity is powerful when it's genuine. It makes two strangers feel like they're discovering something together. The first few months of the relationship felt like that same conversation continuing. Dinner would turn into long talks. Walks around the neighborhood would stretch longer because one question would lead to another. Sometimes we would sit on her balcony late at night with drinks in our hands, talking about things that had happened years earlier in our lives. I remember thinking once that it felt easy to talk to her. Not easy in the sense that the topics were simple. Easy in the sense that she made space for whatever I said. And I tried to do the same for her. At some point, the questions became part of our daily life. When something happened during my day, she wanted to know about it. Not just the headline, the details, the small things, the expressions on people's faces, the parts one might normally skip over. And I did the same when she talked about her day. I would ask about the people she worked with, about the small frustrations she mentioned in passing, about the moments that made her laugh. Those conversations made the relationship feel alive, like we were still discovering each other, even when the topics were ordinary. Eventually, we settled into routines. That happens in every relationship. Dinner after work, weekend grocery trips, evenings on the couch watching shows neither of us was really paying attention to. At first, those routines felt comforting, like we had built something stable together. But somewhere inside those routines, the rhythm of our conversations started shifting. Not dramatically, just slightly. The first change was so small I almost missed it. One evening, she told me about something that had happened at work. A minor disagreement with a coworker. She explained the situation. I nodded, said something supportive, and that was it. The conversation ended. A few months earlier, that same story would have led to more questions. What exactly happened? How did the other person react? What did you say after that? But that night, none of those questions came. Not from me, and not from her either. I noticed the silence for a moment, but I told myself it didn't mean anything. People get tired after work. Conversations shorten sometimes. It felt normal enough that I didn't think about it again. At least not that night. But the same pattern started appearing in other moments. She would mention something about her day. I would listen. Then the conversation would drift somewhere else. Not because we had explored the topic fully. Because neither of us asked the next question. At first, I thought maybe I was just imagining the difference. Relationships change over time. The beginning is always more intense. People naturally relax after a while. I told myself that explanation many times. And for a while, it seemed convincing. But then there was a moment that stayed with me. We were sitting on the couch one evening. She was scrolling through something on her phone. I was watching the television. At one point, she laughed quietly at something she read, the kind of small laugh that usually invites curiosity. In the past, I would have asked immediately, "What's funny?" But that night I didn't. I just glanced over for a second, then looked back at the screen. And the strange thing is, she didn't show me either. She just kept scrolling. It was a small moment, almost invisible, but something about it stayed in my mind. Because that kind of moment used to pull us back into the same conversation. Now it passed without either of us reaching for it. Over time, I started noticing the pattern more clearly. We still talked every day, but the depth of those conversations had changed. We shared information. We updated each other about our lives. But we stopped exploring those things together. The follow-up questions disappeared. And without those questions, something else slowly faded too. Curiosity. One evening, I caught myself doing something strange. She was telling me about a new project at work. As she explained it, I realized I wasn't wondering anything about the story. I was listening, but I wasn't curious. And that realization felt unsettling. Because curiosity had always been the thing that made our conversations feel alive. Later that night, we were lying in bed. The lights were off. She had already fallen asleep. I was staring at the ceiling, and a thought appeared that I hadn't considered before. When was the last time we asked each other something real? Not something practical, not something routine. A real question, something that opened a door into the other person's thoughts. I tried to remember, but the answer didn't come easily. The next few weeks continued in the same quiet rhythm. We still spent time together, still shared meals, still talked about our days. But the conversations moved in straight lines now. They started, they ended. Nothing branched out from them. There was a night when the realization became impossible to ignore. We were sitting at the kitchen table after dinner, two empty plates between us. She was telling me about a coworker who had quit unexpectedly. She explained what had happened, why the person left, how the office reacted. Then she stopped talking, and the silence that followed felt unusually long. In the past, I would have asked something. What do you think really happened? Did you see it coming? But the question never came. Instead, I nodded and said something simple. That sounds stressful. And the conversation ended there. She looked at me for a moment after I said that. Not in an accusing way, just thoughtful. And after a few seconds, she asked something quietly. Do you ever feel like we don't ask each other things anymore? The question surprised me. Not because I disagreed. Because I had been thinking the same thing. I just hadn't said it out loud yet. We talked about it that night. Not as an argument. Just as an observation. She said she had started noticing the same thing a few weeks earlier. That our conversations had become quieter. Not silent. Just less curious. Less open. At one point, she said something that stayed with me. I think we started assuming we already knew everything about each other. And when she said that, I realized how easy that assumption is to make. After years together, it feels like you've heard every story, every opinion, every memory. But that assumption isn't really true. People keep changing. They keep growing. They keep thinking new things. But if you stop asking questions, you stop discovering those changes. The strange thing is that after we talked about it, nothing dramatic happened. We didn't break up immediately. We just sat there quietly for a while. Both of us understanding something about the relationship that had been invisible before. In the weeks that followed, we tried to bring the questions back. Small ones at first. How was your day really? What are you thinking about lately? Sometimes the conversations opened again, but something about the rhythm had already changed. The curiosity felt more deliberate now, less natural, and I think we both sensed that. Because curiosity can't really be forced. It has to appear naturally. The breakup happened months later. Not during an argument. Not during a dramatic conversation. Just during a quiet afternoon when we both admitted something we had been feeling for a while. The closeness between us had slowly faded. Not because we stopped caring. Because we stopped exploring each other. Now sometimes late at night I think about that small shift. The moment when the questions disappeared. At the time it felt insignificant. Just a quieter conversation here and there. But looking back, I realized something. Questions are how closeness moves. They're how two people keep discovering each other. And when the questions stop, the relationship can still continue for a while. You can still sit at the same table. Still share the same routines. Still talk about your days. But something important has already begun to fade. Something quiet. Something easy to overlook. Until one day you realize that the person sitting across from you is someone you haven't really asked about in a very long time. For a while after that conversation at the kitchen table, we both tried to be more aware of it. The questions, I mean. We didn't say we were trying. There was no agreement or plan. But something about that moment had made us both notice the silence that had been growing between us. So in the days that followed, small questions started appearing again. How was work today? What happened with that project you mentioned? Did you ever hear back from your friend about the trip? Normal questions. Nothing deep. But even those felt different now. Because once you notice the absence of something, it's hard not to see it everywhere. At first, I thought maybe we had caught the problem early enough. Maybe this was just a phase. Relationships go through quiet periods. People get distracted by work, by life, by routines. And maybe all we needed was a little attention to bring things back. For a week or two, it almost felt like that might happen. Conversations stretched a little longer. Dinner lasted a little later. There were even a few nights where we stayed up talking the way we used to. Not exactly the same as before, but close enough that it gave me hope. One night we were sitting on the balcony again. It had been months since we had spent real time out there. The city lights were scattered across the distance. A light breeze moving through the air. She was telling me a story about something from her childhood. A memory I had never heard before. And I remember feeling a small sense of relief while she talked. Because for a moment it felt like we had stepped back into the version of the relationship where curiosity came easily, where stories opened doors to other stories, where the conversation didn't need effort. But something about that moment also felt fragile, like a memory being revisited rather than a habit returning. And the next day, the quiet returned. Not completely, just gradually. I think that's what confused me the most during those months. Nothing about the relationship was obviously broken. We weren't distant in the way people usually describe distance. We still shared space, still laughed sometimes, still cared about each other. But something in the connection had lost its momentum. And once that momentum disappears, it's hard to recreate it on purpose. I started noticing something else too. Even when we asked questions again, the answers had changed. Not in their content, in their depth. Sometimes she would answer quickly and move on. Sometimes I would do the same. It wasn't intentional. But the instinct to linger inside each other's thoughts had faded, like a conversation that had learned how to end faster than it used to. There was one moment that made this especially clear to me. We were walking through the grocery store on a Saturday afternoon, the kind of slow routine that had always felt comfortable between us. We moved through the aisles the way we always had, picking things up, talking about what we needed. At one point she mentioned something about a coworker leaving the company, just a passing comment. And normally that would have been an opening for a dozen questions. Why did they leave? Where are they going? What happened? But instead I just nodded. We turned the corner into the next aisle, and the topic disappeared. A few minutes later I realized what had happened. The conversation had closed itself, not because we decided to end it, because neither of us reached for it again. And the strange thing is, it didn't even feel awkward. It just felt normal, which made it even more unsettling. Later that evening we were back on the couch. She was reading something on her phone. I was watching a show that I couldn't fully focus on. At one point she looked up and asked something that caught me off guard. Do you ever wonder if we already know everything about each other? The question hung in the air for a moment. I thought about it carefully before answering. I used to think that was possible, I said. And now, I hesitated. I think people keep changing, even when we're not looking. She nodded slowly when I said that, but neither of us asked another question after it. That's when I started understanding something more clearly. The problem wasn't that we had run out of things to talk about. It was that the instinct to discover those things had faded. Curiosity had slowly been replaced by familiarity. And familiarity can be comforting, but it can also make people stop looking closely. For a long time I wondered when exactly that shift had happened. Was it gradual? Was there a moment we could point to? But the more I thought about it, the more I realized something. It probably didn't happen in a single moment. It happened in dozens of small moments. Moments when one of us could have asked something deeper, but didn't. Moments when a story ended sooner than it needed to. Moments when curiosity quietly stepped aside. Eventually the conversations became shorter again. Not dramatically shorter, just enough that the difference was noticeable if you were paying attention. Dinner would end sooner. The quiet on the couch would arrive earlier. Bedtime conversations would fade more quickly. One night, I caught myself doing something that made the realization impossible to ignore. She was telling me about a conversation she had with a friend, something complicated about the friend's relationship. As she spoke, I noticed something strange. I wasn't wondering what happened next. I wasn't curious about the details. I was simply listening until the story finished. And when it ended, I said something polite. Yeah, that sounds difficult. Then the conversation moved on. A few minutes later, the thought hit me. I had stopped asking questions again. Not because I didn't care, because something inside the relationship had become quieter, less curious, less open. That night we were lying in bed when she spoke again. The room was dark, only the faint light from outside the window. She turned slightly toward me and said something softly. I think the questions were how we stayed close. I didn't answer right away, because I knew she was right. Questions were how we kept discovering each other, how we stayed interested in each other's thoughts, how we made space for new parts of ourselves to appear. Without those questions, the relationship slowly became something else. Something calmer, something quieter, something finished in a way neither of us had fully admitted yet. The breakup happened a few weeks later, not during an argument, just during a quiet conversation where we both acknowledged something we had already started to understand. The closeness between us had faded, and neither of us knew how to bring it back naturally. Now, sometimes late at night, I think about those early conversations, the ones where every answer led to another question, where curiosity filled the space between us without effort. And I realized something simple. Closeness isn't just about love. It's about curiosity, about continuing to ask who the other person is becoming. And the moment those questions disappear, two people can still sit across from each other every night, still share their routines, still share their lives. But something inside the connection has already started to drift away, quietly, almost invisibly, until one day you realize that the person you once asked everything about is someone you stopped asking anything at all. After that realization, something about the quiet between us changed again. Not dramatically, but in a way that made me pay attention to moments I probably would have ignored before. Small things. The kinds of things that don't seem important while they're happening. But later, they start to explain more than you expected. One evening, we were making dinner together. She was standing at the counter cutting vegetables while I moved around the kitchen looking for a pan. The apartment was quiet except for the soft sound of the knife on the cutting board. At one point, she said something about a podcast she had listened to earlier that day. Something about relationships. She explained the general idea for a moment. Then the conversation stopped. And as I stood there looking through the cabinet, I noticed something. I didn't ask what the podcast was about. I didn't ask what she thought of it. I didn't even ask what the episode discussed. The moment simply passed. Later that night, I remembered that small moment again. Not because it was important on its own, because it felt like one of those invisible turning points that only make sense in hindsight. The kind where curiosity had an opportunity to appear, and quietly chose not to. The strange thing is that neither of us seemed angry about it. That's the part people sometimes misunderstand when they imagine relationships ending. They imagine tension, arguments, frustration building over time. But our relationship didn't end that way. It ended in a kind of calm, a calm that slowly replaced the curiosity we once had. I remember another evening when we were sitting on the couch together. The television was on, but neither of us was really watching it. She had her legs pulled up slightly, leaning into the corner of the couch. I was sitting forward with my elbows on my knees. At one point, she said something simple. I talked to my sister today. Normally, that sentence would open a door. What did she say? How is she doing? What did you guys talk about? But that night, the door stayed closed. I nodded. She nodded. And the conversation ended there. A few minutes later, I felt something strange. Not sadness exactly. More like recognition. Because I realized that moment had once been different. At another time in our relationship, we would have explored that conversation together. We would have stayed inside it longer. But now, it felt like both of us understood the conversation was already finished. That realization stayed with me for days. I started noticing how often small opportunities for curiosity appeared and quietly disappeared again. A story mentioned, a memory referenced, a thought left unexplored. None of them dramatic. Just small openings in conversation that once would have been invitations. Now they were simply statements. One afternoon, we were walking through the park again. The same park where we had spent hours talking during the first year of our relationship. The paths were familiar. Trees lining the sidewalks. People walking dogs nearby. At one point, she pointed to a couple sitting on a bench ahead of us. They look like they're on a first date, she said. I looked at them. They were leaning toward each other slightly, talking quickly, laughing, the way people do when every answer leads to another question. And as we watched them for a moment, she said something quietly. They're probably asking each other everything right now. I smiled a little when she said that, because I knew exactly what she meant. We sat on a bench for a while after that. Neither of us said much. But the silence didn't feel uncomfortable. It felt reflective, like both of us were thinking about the same thing, without needing to explain it. After a few minutes, she spoke again. I think curiosity is what makes people feel close. Her voice was calm, almost thoughtful. I nodded, because I had been thinking something similar for weeks. The strange thing about that moment is that it didn't feel like a sad realization. It felt clear, like something that had slowly become obvious. Curiosity isn't just about learning facts about someone. It's about continuing to explore who they are becoming. And when that exploration stops, the relationship doesn't always collapse immediately. Sometimes it just becomes quieter. The weeks after that passed in the same slow rhythm. We still spent time together, still shared our routines. But the energy inside those routines had changed. It felt calmer, more settled, but also more distant. One night we were sitting at the kitchen table again. Dinner had ended. 2 empty plates in front of us. She looked at me for a moment and said something that surprised me. Do you think we already finished asking each other the important questions? The question stayed in the air between us. I thought about it carefully before answering. I don't think people ever run out of questions, I said. She tilted her head slightly. Then why did we stop asking them? I didn't have an answer for that. At least not one that felt complete. Eventually she nodded slowly and said something else. Maybe we stopped being curious about each other. And the moment she said it, the thought felt both sad and strangely peaceful. Because sometimes understanding something clearly removes the confusion that was surrounding it. The breakup happened a few weeks later. Not during an argument, just during another quiet conversation. One where both of us admitted something that had already been true for a while. The closeness we once shared had faded. Not suddenly, just gradually. Now sometimes late at night, I still think about those early conversations. The ones where every answer opened another door. Where curiosity felt endless. Where the questions themselves created the connection. And I realize something that seems obvious now. Questions aren't just about information. They're about attention. They're about saying to another person, I want to understand who you are today. And when that attention disappears, 2 people can still share the same space, still share the same routines, still sit across from each other every night. But the quiet between them starts to grow. Not loudly, not dramatically, just slowly. Until one day the conversation ends, not because anyone decided it should, but because the questions stopped arriving.